Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. So, many of you know that for nearly a quarter of a century, I called myself a libertarian, an objectivist libertarian, but a libertarian nonetheless. Recently, I stopped doing that, and there were a few reasons behind it. Mostly was because some of the despicable things that I was seeing uh, coming from people that were identified with the Libertarian Party or called themselves libertarians. And I said, you know what? I don't care to be associated with that. There are some libertarians that I still consider very, good people that I would align myself with. And there's some that I would very, very much like to debate. And that I have in common with today's guest because I've seen him now on Twitter for several days going back and forth with Dave Smith. If you don't know who that is, we'll get to it in a minute. And he would very much like to debate Mr. Smith. For whatever reason, it's not happening. But anyways, I have him here to tell us about it. His name is Jack Lloyd. He is a multimedia content producer for Liberty. His work spans both fiction and nonfiction and includes his book, The Definitive Guide to Libertarian Voluntaryism, A Vision for a Libertarian Future, and Philosophical Voluntaryism. Jack, welcome to the show.
Hey, it's my pleasure to be on and talk about all things liberty.
All right. So I guess for starters, who is Dave Smith and how are you connected to him?
Sure. So Dave Smith, these days, he kind of brands himself as a libertarian comedian. He, does a bunch of different things you could say with his show, Part of the Problem, and Legion of Skanks. So he's known for his comedy. Certainly has gotten a lot of prominence because of his interviews on Joe Rogan. And, going many years back, he was just someone who was, talking about different issues while he was working up his comedy circuit. So, he's mostly known for those kinds of things, being a comedian and then later on focusing on a libertarian angle with his comedy and with his messaging.
And a lot of libertarians, especially the Mises Caucus variety, wanted him to run for president, correct?
Right. So Dave Smith was originally sought after in 2017. There was this idea that the founder of Mises Caucus, Michael Liebowitz, could get on his show, talk about it, and maybe rope him in along with many other people. Because at the time, the goal was just to get a broad base of libertarians who would be about focusing on the Ron Paul revolution reignited. So that means focusing on ending the wars, ending the Fed, getting private property rights, back in order, decentralization, that kind of thing. And so he was just one person among many who were sought after to try to promote this concept. And it did get a lot of fanfare, and many great people were and are involved, myself included. So he was just one part of that history. And then eventually there was this move to make him more of this front runner for the Mises Caucus with this idea that, he could be the libertarian presidential candidate. And of course, he gave a number of different speeches and was there at Reno in the 2022 takeover. So, certainly, that had a big impact on his brand and notoriety based on his association with the Mises Caucus and the LP.
I should tell you at the outset, I am no fan of the Mises Caucus for a variety of reasons. Fundamentally, I feel that they've taken a man's name without representing his views in the great Ludwig von Mises. But I also see some real negative stuff coming out of that caucus, like very Trumpish type stuff where it gets into personal insults and it's almost like who can be the biggest jerk wins at the end of the day. I also disagree with them on, immigration in the secession and other things, but I just wanted to put that out there. So you and Dave Smith both attended Mises University, correct?
In 2019, me and Dave Smith were both special guests at Mises University. He did a little talk there. I was there as a guest of honor with my wife, the philosopher. So we're there as special guests.
Okay. Have you known him at all on a personal level? Is there like a personal thing going on here outside of the differences of opinion?
There's nothing in a tight personal way. He knows who I am. We have met many times over the years. And he most certainly is aware of me and my work. And in fact, has even debated with me in person. We're at Mises U, and we're discussing things in the courtyard with a big group circling around, which was fun to do. But he, through, I guess you could say, the way that he likes to frame things, he likes to downplay that and that history. Personally, I think because he doesn't want people to be drawn to the work that me and my wife do, because we have differences in our framings and other things like that. And since I have challenged him on his positions and views going way back, in those early days, we're talking, of course, 7+ years ago, he has certainly not liked that. He hasn't liked that back in the day when he was kind of newer to the liberty scene, that we pushed back on some of his framings that were a bit more collectivist. And I guess I would say I wouldn't have had as much of a problem if he just said that he was maybe a Republican in the, Liberty Caucus or something like that, someone who's just a liberty-oriented Republican. Then I wouldn't be bothered, because it's like, okay, you're in the right zone. But I've always found it difficult because he would try to say, oh, I'm the realist libertarian and I'm the most consistent person, and I'm an ANCAP and all these different things. And then he would muddy the waters on those principles in a pandering sense. And for those of us who are heavy into the philosophy and heavy into helping people understand the principles consistently, we found it very frustrating. And so we were like, hey, look, there's different ways to frame this. And if you're advocating for more state violence, then you're not really focused on the ANCAP or small libertarian position. That position is supposed to be, hey, think about how to get the government out of things, how to privatize, not to make things that the government's controlling look better, not to, be like, oh, well, we need prettier public parks, right? And that was, one of our earliest contentions was this discussion about, oh, well, what happens if there's a homeless guy in a park and he's shooting up heroin? Or what happens if there's a homeless guy in a library and all these things? And, what he keeps missing is that if you enable the government to keep covering up the nature of the tragedy of the commons by making things nicer, making it cleaner, whatever it is, then the people are going to see those things. It's like, oh, well, the government's great. See, they provide us with wonderful public parks, and oh, see the roads, they look nice, all this other stuff. And they get deceived because the government then is otherwise stealing from everybody, going to war and doing all these horrible things. And they miss out that that's the nature of the state. And they start believing in statism. And instead of saying, oh, wow, this is the truest sense of what happens when you have the tragedy of the commons and all these miscalculations from the government's central planning. And so he and others will mischaracterize this and say, oh, you want public parks to become these dilapidated places that are all destroyed and horrific. And we're like, no, that's the nature of what happens with central planning. Just like you don't go and look at the Soviet Union and say, oh man, we should have tried to make the Soviet Union better, right? Oh, we need better KGB with the Soviet Union. You say, no, that's the nature of state central planning. And the more you turn that dial, the more things get destroyed and get dilapidated, and there's pain and suffering, from the economic calculation problem. So our framing is that, hey, get people to think outside the state and think about privatization. Whereas they're doing this political thing. We're like, well, we need to pander to a more mainstream audience. And so we need to just talk about the issues that people are afraid of and say, well, we need stronger government in these areas. And so then there really becomes no difference between that and, your typical Republican. Or if you take the Democrat issue and you apply that same logic consistently, you say it's the will of the people for whatever issues there, then you've no longer settled yourself as a libertarian or ANCAP. You're just playing this politics game. And especially for him, it's over something he doesn't control. Because at the end of the day, he's nothing more than a podcaster and a comedian. He's not the head of Border Patrol. He's not running for president, clearly. He's not a governor. He doesn't control 1,951 miles of border. So all he's doing as a human being in the empirical rational reality is communicating to people an unprincipled message that panders to collectivist thinking and gets them to not focus on, hey, we should be unified in getting government out. And so that's what makes us so frustrated. And that's why there's often these, Twitter debates and this or that, but he often will just make personal attacks out of it and do retweets of personal attacks.
I'm going to get to that. I'm definitely going to get to that. But what are the big issues with which you disagree with him?
His framing is certainly a root issue. So when he goes and says it's the will of the people that we need to put the entire U.S. military on the southern border, right? That is not a libertarian solution. You could complain about issues with borders and government picking and choosing who gets to come and asylum issues and all this other stuff for, ballot harvesting, whatever. All these things are serious concerns. But if your solution is to say more government control and putting soldiers on private property and other things like that, you're not helping people become more principled. You're not helping people say, you know what, the government's not the solution to the problem. So he's getting people to buy into this, oh, it's the only realistic thing we can do, and we got to support this. And it's like, well, who are you and what are you supporting, right? Because these people who are talking, it's not like they're even the majority of America or Americans. So they're not hitting some magical lever where it's like, oh, I'm going to hit this button, and all of a sudden, all the borders all around the U.S. are going to be perfect, right? It's just not even possible. There's all these different states with different political bodies because they're sovereign, legally states and governors. And then you have the federal government, and you have all these different competing interests going over. So they're saying to others, you're not realistic, you're utopian. Meanwhile, these people are LARPing like as if they are playing a Sims game and they actually control all the different aspects of these different governments and the border issues. Yeah. And so to me, I just think it's so ironic because in reality, what we're doing as libertarians, we're trying to get people to say, no matter what, I'm not going to let government be the solution to life's problems. And they're saying, you know what? Maybe the government can get it right this time. Maybe if we just vote Republican this time, maybe if we just vote, on the left side, Democrat, whatever. So it just is very frustrating to have to deal with those things. And also, as mentioned, some of these people are very toxic in how they respond.
I'm definitely going to get to that. Definitely going to get to that. But okay. So, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I want to just see if I can give Dave's position and see where you differ with it now.
Absolutely.
As far as I can tell, his position is the same as the Mises Caucus candidate, Mike Rechtenwald. It's a Hoppian argument and basically goes like this, right? If you have a purely private society, the anarcho-capitalist utopia dream, then this isn't an issue because everybody owns their own property and each person gets to decide who comes on their property. The government's not involved in immigration at all. But since we don't have that and there's public land, essentially this public land is collectively owned by the citizenry. And therefore the citizenry gets to decide who comes in and who doesn't. And what he then does is says, okay, look, if you're saying that no, public land people can do whatever they want on it, then why can't you, do you support heroin addicts going into public schools and shooting up or, or homeless people camping out in the streets? So first of all, am I accurately stating his position? Because I think I am, but I want to make sure.
Yeah. As far as I know, I would say that he probably does match that still. Again, people's ideas are constantly evolving these days, as we've been seeing. But traditionally, he has repeated those arguments, from Hoppe. And I don't agree with those at all for many philosophical reasons. There's a lot of problems with that. That's definitely not some of Hoppe's best work. He's done other good things, but I have criticisms with everybody who I love, philosophically. There's things I can find that I disagree with, but that one is a very grave error because it resubstitutes in the collectivism, right? These same authors, right, who are saying, okay, you know what? We don't want tragedy of the commons. We don't want people having these fights over scarce resources with this artificial public property where we know empirically you can't be a public owner of a bench, for example, and have everybody in the public sit on it at the same time. It's rivalrous. You're going to exclude somebody if you sit there. If you sit in a spot, nobody else can. So these are obvious things of basic economics. This is basic economics.
But Jack, the bench is there, right? And the border is there, and there is this public property. So you're an open borders guy, correct? Would that be accurate?
No.
Relatively. I mean, I'm not saying you would say let every soldier come in, but generally, are you for open immigration? Like I'm for open immigration, unless we're at war with a country and their troops are coming over the border, that type of thing. Or if somebody has a plague, I'm not going to let them in. But generally, I'm for open immigration. Are you for open immigration?
So my position, I've written about in this book, A Vision for a Libertarian Future. It is an incredible guide that talks about all those different issues. But the short of it is that the ideas between closed borders and open borders and also their stuff are missing the root of what we're supposed to be advocating for as people who care about property rights. Because it's simply saying, what is the management system that the government's going to do? Because what is a border? Is it a literal line? Like, does the government, draw out a map and then this wall appears magically? No, it is an artificial psychological construct. It's made up in a human mind, and people who act on this in government point guns at people on property, depending on whether or not you cross this imaginary imaginary line. That's the reality of what it is in terms of what is the empirical reality, right? Because we want to be rational about this. So if that's the case, we have to ask ourselves, what gives government the right to control people about this imaginary line and tell them what they can or can't do with others, trade, buy or sell this, that, again, assuming it's non-violent, right? Assuming that we're not talking about murder, rape, theft, trespass, these kinds of things. So as libertarians, the border concept is itself an imposition even on the private property owners who exists there. It's not all privatized, but there's thousands of lots. So the question here is how do we move toward a market order in terms of people moving, traveling, trading, all this other stuff, right? The goal there should be privatization. So open borders, closed borders, it's just a distraction from what is supposed to be the libertarian route, which is, hey, if the government's controlling land, that is a problem. It's creating this artificial public property thing. We should be moving toward privatization of land. And naturally, people are going to be able to, based on their means, do things to trade and travel and all this other stuff, just like they normally do, right? When someone flies in a plane and comes in because like, oh, I want to go visit Disney World. Not weird. Someone goes, hey, you know, I live out of country, but I want to buy a summer home in Florida. Not weird.
But he
right?
agrees with you about that, Jack. He says, yes, the answer is privatization. But right now, what are you going to do? So, for instance, then he poses the example of the school. He says, if public property is fair game, then how do you stop heroin addicts from going into public schools and shooting up, or bums from camping out in the streets? And how do you answer that?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things we have to be realistic about, right? First is when someone says they've already left reality, because that's collectivism. He's not there at some school guarding it. He's not doing anything. He's literally just a podcaster. He's a comedian. He's standing up telling jokes, saying, hey, look at me, come pay my money, for that. That's it. So he's not doing anything. The question is, what's the government doing in their actors? Right. We want to be specific about actors and actions, right? So they're the ones who are in this system of, okay, we're going to point guns at people and say whether you can, go somewhere or not, or, oh, here's this building and, oh, who's allowed in there, but it's government, but it's public, but it's not. It's all word salads. The fact of the matter is that if we're going to move toward a libertarian order, the libertarian focus is we have something that is, right? Currently, we have border control, right? Currently, we have public schools. The government is, saying it's public, we know it's not really. The government controls it, and you can't just go in and out just because you're like, I'm a citizen, I could walk into public school. Obviously not. So we need to be saying, here's our A point, what is, and we're getting to B, which is privatization. And what happens is these people are losing that conversation by saying, oh, instead of going from A, okay, there already is this system going on. There's border patrol agents, all this other stuff. That is what is. We don't have to do anything. It's already going on. We want to get from there to privatization, right? That's the end goal. Going to this, oh, well, how do we manage borders better? Or how do we have better public schools? Completely sidesteps that. It causes people to be like, oh, I'm going to play policy fantasy and hope the government does things the way I want. That's insanity. That's literally saying, I'm just going to pretend like I have this power to do something that you don't. You have to say, wait a second, we need to convince a culture of people to say, we will not support the state. We want to exit this. We want to get kids out of public schools. We don't want them in there. We want to get land privatized. We want to have private industry actually rise up and overtake government function because it's that much better, because people choose it in the market. Just like you have the United States Postal Service and they have a monopoly on letters. You don't sit there and say, we need a better post office. Maybe we should just, spruce things up in the post office. No. We need market competition. We need people to say, hey, they could have private solutions that are much better. So that's my problem, is that they're so focused on, we have to compromise. I'm like, no, you don't. You're not in control of anything. You are in control of your words, and your words affect minds, and those minds affect action. So what do you want to get out of that human action? Do you want people to support the state halfway? Or do you want people to say, you know what? Government's run by a bunch of evil pedophiles. Literally, everybody knows this from Epstein. They are sending our money to every country in the world. They're arming half the world, and they want to disarm us. And you think they're going to do borders right for you when they're picking and choosing who comes along? It's insanity. And so that's my core problem with this, is that he is deceiving a generation of young men into thinking that they are going to magically be like, we're going to do government right this time. And they are deluding themselves and also moving them away culturally from the principles of liberty. And that's where, this root really takes place.
Okay. I just want to say that I disagree. I do not think that the government is being run by satanic pedophiles or of anything. But I don't want to get sidetracked. I just don't want to come off like
that Congress video with the intern didn't help.
Circumstantial evidence doesn't make a general case. But
An Epstein list, though?
well, then you have to argue about what is a pedophile, how many are actually involved, and I don't want to go down that road right now. But what I think this is, so when Dave makes the argument, or when any of these people make the argument about public property, Mike Rechtenwald is big on this. So first of all, you have a border, and it consists of privately owned land, tribally owned land, state-owned land, federally owned land. 30% of it is federal land. So, first of all, I operate from a presumption of liberty. I believe in individual rights. It's wrong to initiate force against people, and the purpose of the government is to protect rights. That's my presumption, right? But then you also have to look, he talks will of the people. Well, you have to go look to the Constitution then. Constitutionally, the federal government has no authority at all to stop immigration. So that would rule out his plan on 30% of the border right off the bat. The federal government simply has no constitutional authority to do it. So he loses there. He also loses with the private property, because on private property, people should be able to do whatever they want. The government has no rights there. And also you're talking about the government initiating force against people that haven't used force against anybody, which is also wrong. Now, if you go to the tribal lands, well, then the tribes get to decide who comes on their lands. Only once you get to the state government does he have any semblance of a case. But I think that if it ends up with Californians voting who gets to cross their border because they're in California, he might have a problem. See, his issue isn't with it's the will of the people. He wants the will of the people to produce a result, and that's a different story. But even with the will of the people, 99 people don't get to choose to violate the rights of one. I'm sorry. And then I think that he brings up this straw man about public schools for a few reasons. One, schools are operated on a local level. They're not operated on a national level like what he wants to send the army in to protect the border. Secondly, the entire purpose of a school is to educate kids. Not only heroin addicts can't go into public schools, but you and I can't just go hang out in a public school, sit down, have coffee and a conversation. That's not what the building is designed for. The purpose of things like roads and sidewalks are mass transit. That's what they are for. So to say that you're going to use force to stop somebody simply because they're from another land, like you said, another arbitrary, designation from walking on a sidewalk or walking on a street is a violation of their rights. Not only that, but restaurants, stores, apartments, all these places generally have open invitations because they say that you need to send a direct invitation. McDonald's never invited me to come in. Right? It's understood they want everybody to come in. Now, in my view, if McDonald's wants to put up a sign that says no immigrants allowed, that they should be allowed to. I have no issue with that. But Dave and his ilk are for telling private companies who they can and can't hire. They're for telling people who they can and can't rent to, who they can and can't have into their homes with a preemptive action, right? They're saying you can't have a certain class of people in your home. And I think that's a violation of individual rights. So I think that his argument when it comes to immigration is far weaker than what he believes it to be. I think that the whole idea of that they're putting forward is a post hoc rationalization. I don't think it stems from any preordained philosophy. I think ultimately they don't like immigrants. So if you don't like him, and I'm not saying all, they're these xenophobes that hate all immigrants. I'm saying that generally speaking, they don't want mobs of immigrants, what they would call an invasion, which is silly on its face, but they don't want that. So they come up with this artificial argument, rationalization about public property and whatever. I just think it's BS. First of all, do you think that my criticism, is that an accurate critique of Dave's position? I want to move on to another issue, but I just want to get any objections that you might have and give you a chance to speak.
Sure. Again, I'm not sure if Dave holds that exact position still, because I've seen him shift over the years. And so, it's difficult to say without him saying it. Whereas I have seen Rechtenwald, I have seen him make that Hoppian argument. And I would agree with you there that there is no philosophical consistency to that. There's many contradictions because, again, when you're like, oh, well, they have to be this net taxpayer thing, there's so many problems that you're going to have, because you could be a U.S. citizen and you're on welfare. You could be a U.S. citizen and you have a government job. You could be a U.S. citizen and you have a private business, but you do a lot of government service or contracts and this or that. You could have that you send your kid to public school and they're going there for 12 years. Okay, is that a benefit now that's like $10,000 or $15,000 a benefit a year that you're now a recipient of, and that counts against your net taxpayer stuff? And then you could have like someone who just walks across the border, goes shopping, they pay a sales tax, and okay, now they're a taxpayer. So it is just a post hoc rationalization. There's nothing consistent about it. Obviously, you can't really do that. It's not meaningful. It's an abstraction. It's a label. There's nothing empirical about it. Like you're doing a study and we're going to do these exact deductions. If you got this benefit from the government, then deduct this. And if you pay this in taxes, okay, fine. But then if you ever spent your money here, then no. It's literally just a Sims game. And it's not even a good one because they don't have anything behind it. There's no material research study or anything that relates to it. It's just playing a silly game. So I think it's cartoonish. And I think that if we're going to talk about individual rights being something that transcends citizenship, obviously, people think about that with other countries. They go, oh, it's so bad that, whatever's happening, in Israel, Ukraine, this or that someone's dying in a war, or these, people are being bombed just because, they're fleeing or this or that. For other people, empathy is unlimited when it comes to U.S. policy, but empathy is about zero when it comes to the U.S. local issues, because the U.S. government kicked out Mexicans in droves after the Mexican-American War under Operation Wetback. In 1954, 1.3 million Mexicans were removed, including many who were actually nationalized U.S. citizens, and they took their land and literally cleared them all out because they just didn't want them there, essentially. It got to a point like, oh, they're taking our job stuff kind of thing, right? And Mexico, of course, they lost 55% of the territory, with the Mexican-American War that went all the way up to California. And that's, of course, why there's many towns that have some very Spanish-y names. So it's really wild that there is this double standard where it's like for other people, maximum empathy. For people on this border, oh, no. Anything the U.S. government has done to purge people out, to displace them, to make them refugees, well, too bad, so sad. That's last week's news. So there's nothing consistent to it whatsoever. It's just cherry picking selective. So that's what I try to bring to the table here, is that consistency in philosophy. And that is only achieved by saying, hey, okay, yeah, we have certain things going on right now. The government's controlling it. Doesn't matter whether you like it or not. You could say wishful thinking all day, snap your fingers. Guess what? Government is still picking and choosing winners and losers. They're saying, oh, you get to be a refugee. Oh, you don't, right? You get to open your business. You don't. Cool. Have you stopped any of that by tweeting, making a podcast? Nobody has. It's hilarious to me. All these people who are criticizing and whining about it, you're doing nothing. So what are we doing if we're going to change the culture? We want people to think outside the state. And so we've got to always bring it back to that. Hey, the government's controlling things right now. They're going to keep controlling things for a while, as long as the culture hasn't changed. But we should work on changing the culture so people say, hey, get the government out of this. Privatize. Public parks, privatize. Border lines, privatize. USPS, privatize. Everything should be privatized. That should be the goal. End the Fed. Free the market. Sound money. Where is this? It's missing because they're politically pandering for the sake of an election so they can score some brownie points on the internet and be like, oh, see, look at me. I did something. I said borders because scary people are coming across. And it's so insane. It's not changing anything meaningfully for liberty. And they don't even bring up the stuff that could be even material. Like, oh, what if there is an actual invasion by an undercover military or something like that? Like, that's not even the forefront thought, like, which could be actually reasonable to be like, oh, we want to stop an undercover, army from building up. Sure. That's at least something more connected to violence, but that's not even the focus.
Well, they come up with these, I don't know if you know who Clint Russell is, but he comes out with these statements about the Chinese are sending their military age men here. And whenever he does that, I just say, okay, again, what is your evidence? What is your proof for these claims that you're making? And of course, one time he called me a federal agent and blocked me because I was asking him to provide evidence. But I think that when it comes to immigration, ultimately, ethically, constitutionally, economically, the closed border types are all on the wrong side of this thing. Now, it seems that there's also a disagreement with the two of you over the Israeli Hamas situation. Is that accurate?
Definitely. There's a disagreement in terms of framing labels and assignments of harm. Yeah.
Okay. So what's the difference between you and Dave? This actually was the straw for me that broke the camel's back, because I was looking at his Twitter feed, and it was just anti-Israel, moral equivalence. And then the Mises Caucus Twitter feed was just, more about bashing Israel than about promoting liberty. And so after a while, I said, I don't want to be associated with that. I don't want to call myself a libertarian. I don't want to be confused. I'm confused. I don't want others to confuse me with people like that. But so what is your difference? What are your differences when it comes to Israel with Dave
Right.
Smith?
So my stuff's going to be very nuanced because I'm an ANCAP. So I'm against all governments, Israel included, and stuff like that. So it's not really a matter of picking and choosing here. I'm against statism as a concept generally. But just because I'm against statism doesn't mean that I have a completely naive view of history and miss out on all the things that developed and led to what is present. And I don't then stop, having philosophy about where we're at now and where we want to go if we want a libertarian future. Right. So when it comes to the Israel issue, the people who are big Israel haters often are deriving that hate because of a few factors. One, I would say root factor is Scott Horton's probably the thought leader of this in many ways. And he agreed with Justin Raimondo back on, antiwar.com in the old days that, Israel's like the worst thing ever, and they should even call for a private boycott of Israel. And so their issues there is that they think Israel is nothing more than a pure occupying force, that it's a bunch of these white Jews, Ashkenazi Jews coming down, and they're a bunch of Middle Eastern brown person murderers and enslavers because they came down and created a nation and they created a state. So there are two sides to that. There is a truth that the creation of Israel involves violence because that's the nature of governments. And when you create a government, people want to fight you over it and fight for power. So most certainly the creation of Israel came with people being murdered or killed in casualty and all that other stuff. Tragic. That's the nature of statism, right? You play status games, you get status prizes. Israel's just not unique in that. And so what they do is they attempt to make it seem like this is the worst government ever because, they had the Nakba and a bunch of the people living there fled in fear because of actually mostly because of a propagandized fear. Because of Deir Yassin, it was a town that the IDF took over because they were trying to stop a blockade that was starving 100,000 Jews in Jerusalem.
Deir Yassin was one of the actual places where the Jewish forces were wrong, where they actually did commit atrocities. And so Deir Yassin is really sort of grabbed on by a lot of folks.
I would say it's a complicated thing because there's atrocities in terms of statism, right? So when you're talking about atrocities, right, you're talking about government agents who are killing people in their homes and stuff like that because they throw in grenades to take down, the people who are armed there and shooting and stopping transport going to Jerusalem. So yes, that certainly did happen, right? There was innocent people, you could say, who died in that process, and that was definitely evil. So I don't approve of that, of course. But this idea that, there was this massacre of people where the Jews just came in and raped the women, stripped out babies, from pregnant mothers, paraded them in the streets and spat in them, and all this other, hyper centralized fashion. That was a lie. And that was promoted by many of the Arab leadership at that time. Sure. Because they wanted to instill fear enough to be like, see, this is why the armies have to come in and help us, right? The whole point of that was to create this war to get the Jews out, essentially. So there was lies about that. It wasn't actually a massacre. There was actually people who bullhorn and be like, hey, get out of here. And they took, people away and of course, tried to get women, children, all that stuff out of the way. But yes, so that's why this whole situation then had a chain effect where a bunch of people fled. And then, of course, the state of Israel didn't let them back in afterward, essentially, except for those who stayed, right? Those who stayed, 150,000 about, became full citizens, and now it's like near 2 million people, Arab Muslims. So there's this crazy framing with this where they say, okay, all the Jews who are there are just settlers, occupiers, right? Even though there was Jews who moved down peacefully well before this, and they themselves were attacked. There was Jews who were killed in different riots, especially with Al-Husseini, who instigated these riots. So there's this whole missing backdrop.
Also expelled from Arab countries.
Well, and that's its own other special thing to talk about because there's, more than that in terms of Jews who were pilgrimed out of Arab countries, over 850,000, places like Iran, where they said, if you want to leave here, you have to give up all your property. You can leave with 2 shirts, a watch, 50 dinar, that kind of thing. So people will ignore all those acts of violence in the Arab countries and Jews having to come to Israel to get refuge. They're like, oh, well, that's because Israel was created, right? No moral agency, responsibility for those violent governments. So we're stuck in this position where basically people are trying to play two sides of a coin, right? If you want to ascribe this boogeyman to Israel, this like they're all evil, they're all occupiers, there's a huge philosophical problem because that describes most of the countries around the world, because most of the countries that we know today are built on these types of imperialistic conquests from the Berlin Conference and the scramble for Africa, and all those conflicts are created by the government and then taxing people and exploiting them. And they even said, well, we're not going to have slavery. We'll be better than the Arab slave traders. But then they went and they just had a hut tax and taxed everybody and controlled everybody with the new government, right? It's always a double speak. Or, you know, the American experience, right? Built upon British colonialism, imperialism. Then, of course, the federal government went and wiped out a bunch of natives, put them on reservations, killed the buffalo. I mean, they pushed out the Mexicans. They, you know, all these different things apply to all these other countries around the world from various colonial conquests. So you can't be like, okay, Israel's this white colonial occupier from Europe, and we need to reset that, and then be like, but everywhere else in the world, that's fine. They can just say that. It's insanity to me, because there's a philosophical hypocrisy. Either you think, okay, the U.S. government needs to let the natives rule or Mexicans back in because, oh, well, they were repatriated and they were expelled. Or you sit there and say, hey, we can't fix all the past. We understand that there's tragic things that happen because of governments being formed. That's the nature of statism. How do we not have further conflict and struggles for power over the next democratic thing, which is where this gets lost in the translation. People start to say, well, we need a two-state solution, or they need to have democracy. It's like, whoa, you're adding more government. You're adding more voting. Are you getting to a libertarian order this way? No, you're just adding people to vote, and they want to vote for violence, for another form of government that is equally, if not more violent, with Hamas. So it's another insanity where someone loses sight of, hey, are we getting toward a libertarian order? Because they want to have this leftist narrative of Jews are all occupiers and there's nothing good about Israel. Oh, see, look at the Israeli lobby and all this other stuff. And funnily enough, meanwhile, in Israel, Jews there are like, oh, Israel, the Knesset, they're too influenced by the U.S. lobby, right? So on both sides, you get both sides hating each other's government, saying, "Oh, they're too much of an influence," right? It's the nature of statism. People fighting each other over who's getting ruled, who's being more influenced, and they're missing the whole bigger picture, which is, hey, government's not the solution to problems. You should be thinking about how to get government out, privatize, move toward a libertarian order. That's property rights, free trade, free speech, these Western values that we hold dear here in America, at least in name only, you know, and through the brainwashing centers of public school, right? So, you know, they don't apply that there. Like, where's the call for, no, we need property rights. We want de-escalation. We want to end gun control in Israel, which is another thing, right? Here, it's obvious. Oh, yes, if people have guns, then there'll be less violence because they can stop bad guys. So does that not apply to Jews in Israel, right? So it's just all these things that are lost in translation when it comes to geopolitics over things that people don't even control, right? They're complaining about things 4,000, 6,000 miles away, have nothing to do with them in terms of their day-to-day, right? Like, they're not in charge of the Israeli government where they can be like, I'm going to help make restitution or something. They're not even there. And meanwhile, the Americans here are just tweeting and blogging and stuff like that. And it's like, okay, if you have these values that occupation is bad, where's your action for your local occupation, for restoring things to Native Americans or Mexicans? You're never going to hear it, because they're going to sit there and say, well, actually, we need borders here. You know, just like the borders on Rafah, you know, by Egypt and then Israel, they have strong borders, right? The people say, oh, open air prison. I sit back, I'm like, you mean strong borders? Because that's what that is. It's strong borders, not an open air prison. And you don't like that, because if you say strong borders about what is, you know, Gaza, then it calls into question everything else about your borders claim. Because in reality, if you have giant walls and barbed wire and, it's hard for people
on
to
all
know,
sides.
Really,
yeah, you're right.
Then suddenly, oh my gosh, the reason that these people, I call them an open air prison, is because they can't go freely trade and travel. So it's so ironic. They're sitting there complaining about Gazans can't freely trade and travel uninhibited. They have to do, you know, checkpoints, and that, you know, and they might get spied on or this or that. And it's like, okay, yeah. Do you know what happens in the U.S. borders where, you know, Border Patrol goes, oh, we can ruffle through your things and take your laptop because, you know, 11th Circuit says we don't even need reasonable suspicion to take your laptop from you. I mean, it's like, they don't get it.
You've avoided a pitfall that a lot of libertarians fall into, and that is the state's bad, therefore all states are equally bad, and all, you know, they're worse than anything that's not a state. William F. Buckley once said of Murray Rothbard that Murray couldn't distinguish between pushing a woman down to get her out of the way of an oncoming vehicle and pushing her down to steal a wallet, to steal her purse. That Murray would just say, no, you're pushing her down. And I think a lot of these folks that criticize Israel from the libertarian perspective, they do just that. They say it's a state, therefore it's bad. Anything it does, it's bad. It's evil. And you've avoided well, you seem to. I mean, it's only one conversation, but I'll give you that. Now, I want to talk to you about your experiences with Dave Smith. I made a post a couple weeks ago after because he posted that Tucker Carlson is an American hero. And I didn't even tag him in. I just posted, I said, look, Dave Smith says Tucker Carlson's an American hero. That reveals Dave Smith's character and why he should not be listened to. Somehow, this went around and it got back to him, and he comes to me and he says, people do listen to me, but they'll never listen to you. And I've seen that over and over again, this idea that I have all these followers. Like I've seen him say, he said it to me. I've seen him say it to you. He said, as if the fact that he has followers means he's right. And of course, it means no such thing. Now, I get it. A lot of people want to debate him. I get it. And you can't debate every single person, but that doesn't mean you tell people they're irrelevant or they're not important enough for you to debate in that sort of thing. And that seems to be what comes from him and his followers, who really were just, I mean, I've seen some talk about anti-Semitism. Oh, because my last name's Liebowitz. Well, look at your last name and, that sort of thing. And they're just, and I'm just like, can you debate without insulting? Is that your style? Now, has that been your experience, not just with him, but with his followers as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it's not really surprising to me because at the end of the day, remember, Dave Smith is a comedian first. So you just like look
See,
at
I
what
hate that. I hate that. I hate when comedians do that. When comedians say stuff and then you call them on it, and then it's, well, I'm just a comedian. I can,
Right. He uses the comedy shield, and he's done that for a long time. And I, to a degree, I'm not even fully sure every time whether that's even him, because I'm not even sure whether it's always him tweeting or some social media manager, because he's on Gas Digital, he's on a bunch of different things. And I know some like to keep Twitter close to the chest, but when you have 500,000 followers and you're on all these different shows and all this other stuff, I sometimes wonder if it really is him always. But I can say personally, obviously having met him several times, he certainly is that shaming. So if it's a social media manager doing it, he definitely fits it. It's not like, oh, that's something he wouldn't say. So, what I mean? Whatever. He definitely would. And he works in that, modus operandi. He works from this idea. It's a Twitter method, right? For brownie points. You'll take someone's position, retweet it, mischaracterize it, put a shaming label. And then what happens after that is that people focus then on the shaming label. Like, oh, see, he said something about him that's like, you're stupid, you're nothing, you have no followers, right?
Yeah, he destroyed you.
Right. And then they get lost in the sophistry, right? It's a fun tactic if you want to have an audience made up of sophists, right? If you want a bunch of dysfunctional bros who can't make an argument, can't think that one-upmanship by calling someone names is the equivalent of having thinking skills, then you'll have an audience of imbeciles. And Dave Smith has certainly made a part of his audience that, not saying they all are, because there's definitely smart people who follow Dave Smith. And I think those smart people listen to Dave Smith at his best, right? But Dave Smith at his worst, and his comedy stuff is very clear. He doesn't actually engage in reason and evidence when he's talking about those things. He intentionally loads in a personal insult so that people focus on that. And then he has his ratio, which is a bunch of his toxic, followers being like, oh, you have autism or you're stupid and all this other stuff. And to me, it's just comedic, because I've been doing this liberty thing for like 20 years. I've been an activist for a very long time, with Anarchy Ball and other things like that, where I'm used to dealing with hordes of commies and being very small, right? When you're an ANCAP in a world of, 2013, that's not when it's very big. You know what I mean? That's when everybody thinks that you're stupid or, whatever. So I'm used to constantly being pounded by tons of insults and all sorts of stuff. And you know what we do? We just stay principled. We stay focused on the goal of educating people on ethics and economics and getting the end game of privatization. Because if you keep homing in on that, eventually the right people will come to you, because they're like, hey, you actually want to engage with reason and evidence. You want to talk about this philosophically and be consistent. All these people just want to call names, and the right people get drawn to in the end. It's very obvious, in terms of, American culture too, that the majority of people are not going to be, terribly bright when it comes to reason and evidence and things like that. Again, not because they're necessarily, completely dumb in the head, that kind of thing. It's more so public school has completely destroyed their ability to think, right? Schooling is itself a brainwashing process where it's just regurgitate whatever they say within a certain time, or they're going to shame you. And then you have to do that to obey authority. Otherwise, you're no good. It has gotten people into this mode that where they think repeating something from, some authority that's truth, as opposed to, okay, what's the causation? What's the effect of reason and evidence? Does this hold up consistently? So that's what me and my wife do very often. The content we do includes things like talking about argumentation, how to make an argument, how to deal with fallacies and things like that. You're not going to get that from Dave Smith, of course. You'll get
I heard somebody, it might have been him, it might not, but
you're not going to get that.
Somebody said to your wife, your dorky husband or something. That's something stupid. But the funny thing to me is, within the libertarian world, yes, Dave Smith is a big name, 500,000 followers. That's a lot.
Absolutely.
But in the world at large, even in America at large, you go into a supermarket and ask somebody, Dave Smith. No. I mean, you're talking about a political party that ultimately gets 1% of the vote. And he's, a big name, well-respected within one faction of that 1%. And he acts like he's, a Brad Pitt or Tom Cruise or something. Like, you're not that known guy to where you can throw around, look how known I am and look how small you are. But nonetheless, that's what he does. He's not the only one. I got into it with Josh Smith a little bit, and Josh Smith did the same thing to me. Oh, when you get X amount of followers, then I'll debate you. And so and then he made some anti-Semitic remarks to me. So he told me to stop Jew-splaining to him. So I just left him alone. And then he says to me, after he refused to debate me, he said that I'm a coward who runs away from the conversation. And I'm just like, am I losing my mind here? You literally refuse to debate me. I can literally show and post the link, right? And I can show people that you said you would not debate me. And now you're calling me a coward and saying I'm running away from you. And it's like, I'm just waving to my stepson here, my girlfriend's son. But, yeah, and that's the sort of the world, and it's so divorced from the world of ideas that I'm interested in that you seem to be promoting, you and your wife.
Yes, and that is an important thing to realize, that there's some people who their chief goal is simply, do I have enough followers? Am I getting enough money for whatever events I'm doing, this or that? Am I chasing the right type of rhetoric in order to get that support from the next thing? Whereas, with me, I certainly do love money. I'm a big capitalist. Absolutely. I love making money, but principles always come first. Yes. And so I won't shy away from talking about important issues, even with big people. If they say, oh, you're going to lose followers, is that? I'm like, I don't care. Because at the end of the day, my goal is to get people so principled that no matter what propaganda comes out from the government, from CNN, from MSNBC, they don't get tricked by it, right? You can't do that if you are in a fear-based mindset where it's like, oh, what's the next boogeyman? Oh, terrorists here, immigrants here. Oh, there's the next war, this or that. And people have their amygdala, their fight or flight response, or sometimes freeze, but they have it triggered. And they get into this panic mode, and the government profits off of that, not like financially, but they try to take the opportunity to get people to be like, oh, see, this is why you need more government, right? So it's an age-old tactic, fear propaganda, false flags, all this type of stuff to trick people into giving up their liberty. And unfortunately, what really unnerves me the most is some of these people are giving into that. And Dave Smith, because he does have a significant following, you could say, for libertarians and stuff like that, again, don't need to compare to other people, just say, okay, yes, he obviously has success. No duh. That makes it more concerning. Right? If it's just some random Twitter account, I don't care if they say something stupid, but if Dave Smith says something bad, he could be influencing hundreds of thousands of people. He could be literally causing a whole generation of young men to be like, oh my gosh, this is the most important election of our lifetime. We need to have a strong government, stronger borders. We need to give them more power and control of our lives so we can stop the invasion, this or that. It's like, whoa, dude, you've lost the goal. You've lost the whole point of this philosophy, of this message. Is to get young men and young women and whoever else, old people too, to actually say, I'm going to consistently think outside the state. The government is not the solution. We need to say, no more funding everybody. No more stealing our money. No more of this war BS nonsense and funding both sides, which happens. Israel's not the only government funded. People are like, oh, well, Israel has a large amount compared to others. I'm like, yeah. And depending on the year, like in 2019, Afghanistan got more money. Again, it's who's in power, who's playing what cards. The government's funding everybody, giving arms everywhere, and then be like, oh, look, more conflict. See, we need more power. It's the same thing. You didn't learn from 9/11, right? And the war on terror. Come on. So I'm trying to bring people out of that and not get lost in picking who's the lesser or worse person. You know, as happened right with Ukraine. Some people horseshoed on Ukraine, going from, okay, Ukraine obviously shouldn't be getting money. They have corruption with Joe Biden and Burisma and Hunter Biden, all that stuff. But that doesn't mean that Ukrainians don't exist as a people. They don't have lives and families. It doesn't make Putin not a murderous dictator. Right. It's like you can sit there and say, yes, there's the nature of statism. You have corruption on both sides and you cannot trust them. The solution is to get government out, stop funding this war, stop escalating and murdering people. We need property rights. We need free speech. We need free trade. That should be the core. And it's getting lost because they're playing the media cycle, right? The media cycle is a programming cycle. Operation Mockingbird. The CIA runs in different people into offices and they have their talking points. They get their talking points from the deep state and they set the agenda. And then the war bloggers and all these other people follow that agenda. They themselves follow the agenda that they claim, oh, don't follow it. It's manipulations. And they're writing about it and they're addicted to that cycle because that's what gets them the clicks and that's what gets them the money. And oh, see, it's the current thing. And they get lost in it. And there's nothing wrong with saying, okay, here's what's going on in the world. But it's another to say, oh, here's what's going on in the world. And if you don't focus on this right now and use our language, then you're evil. You want genocide. And they have become the leftists they claim to critique in America who say, oh, if you're white, you're privileged and you have power and you're racist by default. They have just come full circle and they haven't even recognized it yet. They haven't recognized they have become the people that they hate, that they criticize, that you better toe the line or you're a part of genocide. And meanwhile, what are they doing? Writing articles, blogging? What lives were saved? How many wars did you stop? How much funding did you stop? Zero. They have stopped zero. Nada. Nothing. So what's the end result? If it's just confusing people, if it's just getting to become unprincipled, you're upending the work everyone else has done for all these years, who toiled like Ron Paul did and worked so hard to wake people up and say, hey, government's not the solution. So, you know, it's just really a core passion of mine. And that's why I'm just so passionate about reorienting the conversation and getting away from this toxicity of this name calling, shaming, all this nonsense. Just for points, just to be like, oh, cool, look at this. I got more followers now. It's so silly. It's so childish.
Well, speaking of followers, where can people find you?
They can find me in all kinds of places, but my website, Jack V as in voluntarist, jackvlloyd.com is a great place to connect. There's links to a bunch of different things because I do a lot, as you did, note before, right? I had my book there, Vision for Libertarian Future. I have the Definitive Guide to Libertarian Voluntaryism, which is an excellent book, super popular. I have my latest book, Philosophical Voluntaryism, that gets into philosophy because obviously philosophy matters, causation matters, rationality matters. I also have, my kids' book here that just came out, The Unschooled Adventures of Jack and Pho, which is about getting kids out of public schools because, again, that's just more state programming. And then my comic book series, Voluntarist, which just successfully funded. And a big props to you, Eric July. Thank you so much for your support. And Ripperverse, shout out to you. But we just finished our latest ARCS funding, and we have out this trade paperback now, which is absolutely gorgeous. But everything I do, I try to bring it back to the principles of liberty and get people to think outside the state. So thank you so much for having me on, Michael. Thanks for checking it out.
And thank you so much for being here. For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Liebowitz. Remember, leave your likes, leave your dislikes, and even share if you want. Till next time.